Hey, how is everybody? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Good morning.
Yes. Great.
Anybody have any questions before we get started unrelated to this stuff? Okay. So I've had a ton of requests from people who are like, hey, what can I do to make our offer, more competitive? And our market is crazy. I had a call from a lender yesterday. And it's not like one of my really like preferred lenders, but I just closed a deal with him. And he said, hey, do you have any pocket listings coming up under 400,000? I have a waiting list of 40 people, and this is just one lender, and there's hundreds of lenders out there. So, the market right now is crazy, especially in the lower price points. And so what I kind of did is I put together a huge list. There's about 30 or 40 things that I've got here. So take notes. Mine are just notes, so they wouldn't necessarily make sense to you if I just sent you a list of all these things. So take your own notes that maybe can help you later as you're, trying to advise your offer or advise your clients as to what they may, need to consider offering in these markets. Before we actually start talking about some of these, the important thing is that regardless of whether you are a buyer's agent or a transaction broker for the buyer, you have an obligation to advise your clients. And there is a little bit of a misconception, right? People say, well, I'm a transaction broker, I can't advise them. And that's not true. You can't advocate for them. But if we actually look at the exclusive right to buy, which I'll share here real quick. We look at the exclusive right to buy, you'll see in section 5.1.4, which is these are uniform duties, whether you're a transaction broker or a buyer's agent. It says that you have to advise the buyer regarding the transaction. Okay, so all these things that we're going to talk about today, there are certainly things that are potentially risky for your clients. Unfortunately, that's just part of the nature of a seller's market, is that buyers are going to have to be competitive. So make sure that you really know and understand these things if you're actually going to incorporate them into your offer. Some of these things that we'll talk about, like I said, I've got about 38 on my list. Some of these are specifically related to the offer, and some of these well before the offer ever even materializes. And it's basically psychological warfare, which is crazy, but that's what our market dictates right now, is that buyers are just doing what they can. So perfect example for you is, right from the very time that you schedule the showing, right, you got to think, okay, if this is the house that my clients are going to want to write an offer on, what is it that I can do to hopefully sway the listing broker and hopefully sway the sellers to accept our offer? And what I'll tell you is there's no guarantee, in trying to work all of these 35, 40 things into an offer would be an absolute nightmare. Many buyers are not willing to do all of these things. They don't want to take that kind of risk and all, whatever. But consider every home as if you're going to show the one that your clients are going to write an offer on. And so, just maybe one thing that you could do is have a stack of thank you cards in your car, right? And have your clients fill out a thank you, just a short, sweet, you don't need to include anything, that would put your clients in a protected class or anything, but just a little note that says, hey, thanks so much for letting us show your home. We really appreciate it, right? This really only works for an occupied home. If it's vacant and the sellers are gone, maybe don't bother with this one. But if it's occupied, these people have taken their time to let you in their home. They've cleaned it, right? They're burning up electricity with all their lights on or whatever. They're going through the zoo that's 30 showings back to back to back to back to back, right? So a little thank you note, maybe drop a $5 gift card to Starbucks in there, right? And have it be from the buyers, because if it comes from you, right, it's not as warm and cozy as a note from the buyers, right? But if the buyers up front are putting that seed in the seller's mind that, hey, we really like your house, we appreciate the fact that you took your time to do these things, right? And then maybe on your business card, right, you can just write a little thank you on the back. Hey, thanks for letting us see your home. It's beautiful, right? Super simple, easy to do. But it's one of those psychological warfare things, right? That you're doing right from the beginning that is hopefully going to put you above and set you apart from any of these other buyers who are going to be offering on the property. Okay. Um, in addition to that, I will tell you professional communication with the listing broker can certainly go a long way. Now, the caveat to that is don't be, someone who is like calling incessantly, texting incessantly, right? And bugging the crap out of the listing broker. Okay. Get what you need from them and communicate professionally with them. Maybe a little bit different story when we're in a buyer's market, right? But I've been there where I've just been crazy busy and I didn't have a lot of time to, chat with a listing broker and whatever else. And so I just draft up an offer for my buyer, send it over, right? Don't even talk to the listing broker. And it never works out in a multiple offer situation, right? Call them, ask them what's important to the seller. Hey, what is it that your sellers want? What is it that your sellers need? Specifically, you can ask, hey, what is it that can set my offer apart from any other offer that would make this the most attractive offer to the seller? And then listen. But it doesn't do you any good if your clients aren't willing to have some flexibility to do what they're asking you to do. A perfect example, I just listed a property a couple days ago. The sellers have a new construction home that won't be done until like April 10th, right? And so part of their best case scenario would be, hey, we close in, let's say, 30 days, and then we have 45 days worth of post-closing occupancy with some flexibility. Well, of the 6 offers that we got on our home, 5 of them had some form of accommodation, whether it was a long closing, right, or a quick closing with a significant post-closing occupancy period. Of those 5, 4 of them were closing early with post-closing. The other one just said, hey, let's just close on April 10th or whatever day you guys need. And of those 4 that were offering post-closing occupancy for like 45 days, 2 of the 4 were doing it for absolute free. One of them was doing it with 0 security deposit, right? So they were wanting to make it super easy for my clients to say, hey, like, we will accommodate your needs, right? They wouldn't have known that if they didn't ask. So ask the listing broker, what is it that's important to the sellers? Listen, and then if your clients can do it, do it. Okay. Another one that starts well before the offer is etiquette at the seller's home during the showing, right? These days, so many sellers have either audio and or video recording, which there's a whole legal side to that, which we're not going to get into in this class. But just assume that every seller has audio and video recording at their home, right? And so if you see the wallpaper that has the floral designs on it, right, and you're making fun of it because it looks like an old lady lives there, and I apologize, I'm just giving an example. Sorry if you have the floral wallpaper, I'm not making fun of you, right? But if your clients are doing that,
and watch yourself about being old too.
Yeah, Harry was alive before wallpaper was invented, so yeah, just kidding, Harry. Love you, man.
So was I, Harry. I'm with you, buddy.
So just assume that every seller has audio and video recording, right? They don't want, how do you want to see yourselves in the sellers, or how do you want the sellers to see you while you're viewing their property, right? Very professional. You can, comment on things that you like, right? The maybe flip side to this is you're probably not going to have any, leverage as far as negotiating goes if you're spewing all this stuff about this is the perfect property for us and whatever. Well, if you're in a hot market, negotiating probably goes out the window, right? You're not trying to negotiate in a sense of what can I take from the sellers, right? You're negotiating in a sense of how the heck do I get my client's foot in the door? So you do need to be careful, but certainly assume that every seller has audio and video in the home. And how do you want your client to appear if they do happen to be watching? Okay. Another thing that happens before the offer, right? As you're going through and viewing their home, again, this is really an occupied home thing. try to pick up on some of the seller's interests, right? If they have a whole, I've got a buddy, right, and he's all into like Lego. He's like a grown man, right? 35 years old. I'm not making fun of you if you have a Lego room, right? But he's got all of his little Lego figurines and stuff, right? And so, again, maybe try to connect with them on that level, right? Pick up on some of their interests, and we'll talk about that a little bit further on, okay? So we'll talk about some ways that you might be able to connect with them in that regard. And if you guys have ideas, I'm not here to listen to myself talk, guys, and this is not an all-inclusive list. So jump in if you guys have, things that have worked for you or whatever. And just so you know, I am saving some of the juicy ones for the end. So hopefully leverage for you guys to stay and listen to some of these. Some of these are going to be, things that are obvious to you, but I promise you there's some stuff in here that you either haven't done or you haven't maybe even heard of before. So hopefully this is valuable to you guys. One of the things that you can do is complete, in many cases, the listing broker will upload all of the disclosures, right, into the MLS. Well, if they're that type of broker who uploads all of those forms into the MLS, then when you write your offer, fill out all of the forms, right? If I'm a listing broker and I'm I do a large volume of business, I don't have time to go track you down to get what I need from you later, right? And so if you've done your job, right, I've uploaded those disclosures and whatever else, then what I want is I want you to fill them out and I want you to complete them, right? And that includes the listing broker's signature in the contract, right? There's no reason that you can't go, not the signature, but the signature block, right? There's no reason that you can't pop their name in there. There's no reason that you can't go look up their license number and their brokerage license number from Dora and put it in there. It's one less thing that they have to worry about, right? And what it does is it says, hey, Liz, I see that you know what you're doing. You took the time to be a diligent agent. You're going to be easy to work with. You understand what you're doing. I'm not going to have to chase you later, right? And so you might have a little bit more sway as far as the listing broker, recommending to their clients, hey, like, yeah, this other offer looks really good on paper, but this agent's an idiot, versus, hey, this is a really, really close second, and this agent was very professional. They knew what they were doing, and I promise you guys, it can set you apart. Okay. Another thing you could consider doing, particularly for offers that are financed offers but have a significant down payment, so 20%, 30, 40, 50% down payment, right, is not only send the lender letter that says, hey, yeah, they're pre-approved for whatever the loan amount is, send an actual proof of funds showing that you have that money, even though there's a checkbox that says, yeah, the buyer has the money readily available, right? In some cases, I don't trust you, not because you're you, but because I don't trust anybody, right? So if you want to show me that your buyer has purchasing power, then show me that your buyer has purchasing power. Don't just check the box, right? So if you're buying a $500,000 house and you're putting $250,000 down, show me a screenshot of the account that has their name on it with their loan balance, right? Block out the account number and whatever else you need to block out on there, but show me an account that has their name on it with that dollar volume. Now, again, you may have to advise your client that could certainly work against them. If you show them an account that has, $600,000 in it, and you're paying, $500,000 for a house, they might go, hey, let's do 6 because you have 600,000, right? But in many cases, they're not going to do that just because they see how much money you have, but showing that you have purchasing power, particularly if you are using an appraisal gap clause, which we'll talk about, that certainly could help to set you apart and show that, yes, hey, not only do I have the funds for my down payment, I also have the funds to clear my appraisal gap clause if our appraisal comes in short. Okay.
Hey, Jesse. Quick question. We worked with a referral agent in California just this last week or so, and he was saying that he got the client in by getting them underwritten ahead of time.
Yep.
How is that possible? Because do you do it for the specific property?
Well, pre-qualified versus pre-approval, right? Two different things. Pre-approval is typically they've run through what's called desktop underwriting, which is effectively where they say, hey, I've looked at your tax returns, I've looked at your W-2s or your 1099s, right? And I've actually verified all of this information. And then I've run it through, typically it's desktop underwriter, but there's a couple, programs that lenders use. And effectively what it does is it creates what's called a conditional approval. It's not a full pre-approval. In order to truly have an approved file, you have to have an address, you have to have a contract, right? And so the lenders have like disguised some of the terms that they use to make it sound better than it really is. So certainly asking the lender, right, like, hey, have you verified their taxes, their employment, their income, all of these things, right? That's about as good as you can get in many cases, because they truly can't, if there's a loan, it truly can't have a completely approved file until you have the contract, the address, an appraisal, right? It's subject to all of those things, regardless of how far the lender has verified all of that information. Okay.
Okay. So partial underwriting, essentially.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Running desktop underwriting, which is just a computer program that basically says, hey, based on the information that you fed me, we'll offer what's called a conditional approval. Conditional approval just means, hey, yeah, this loan is approved subject to A, B, C, D, E conditions, right? And those conditions might be verification of employment. I need a letter stating where you got the down payment money from, right? The letters of explanation for various things that might be in their credit report or whatever. So typically it's a conditional approval, and who knows what those conditions are. I mean, they could be super easy to clear, or they could be like, hey, this condition, I don't know, it scares me a little bit. So, lenders have kind of dressed it up and disguised it as to what it really is, but it's a conditional approval is what it is.
Now, if you do that, Jesse, can you remove the loan contingency at the purchase offer though?
Hang on to that thought.
Okay.
Okay. We'll go there.
Hey, Jesse,
Yep.
can you define, you said two things, pre-approval and the other one was
Pre-qualification.
okay, can you define that real quickly?
Yeah, so pre-qualification is basically where I just go to a lender and I say, hey, I make, X number of thousands of dollars per year. Here's the debt that I have. Roughly, what do you think I can qualify for as far as a purchase of a home? And then they'll make some assumptions about credit and whatever else, but they haven't actually pulled your credit, all that other stuff, right? Pre-approval is where I'm not just taking your word for it. I'm actually verifying the information that you've told me, all of these other things, running it through that desktop underwriting and getting that conditional approval. Okay.
Thanks.
Yep. Other questions? Okay. Another thing is, and I was talking to someone about this a couple days ago, don't create contingencies that your buyer would never use or need. Okay. Perfect example, a couple perfect examples, right? So we have a contingency in the contract, or the buyer has a contingency in the contract for due diligence documents, right? Well, if what you're asking for in the due diligence documents is manuals for the appliances, right? The owner's manual for the fridge and the oven and the stove and whatever else, right? Is your buyer going to actually terminate the deal based on unsatisfactory information that's in the manual for the fridge, the owner's manual? I've never worked with a buyer in 13 years that goes, hey, like, this deal is contingent upon me looking at the owner's manual for the oven. All right. So if that's not a thing, then don't add it into the contract. Now, there might be some deals where, you might have some due diligence documents that you might be concerned about. Maybe, if there's, basement finish and you don't know whether it's permitted or whatever, right? You might request some documents from the seller that really would be important to your buyer's decision in purchasing the property. Okay. However, if it's something you're not going to ever use, then don't put it in there. Another example that this came up with an agent this week, and his client was purchasing a condo, right? And a condo is effectively airspace. You don't own the land, you own the box in the air, right? And he had an ILC survey deadline in there. Well, if you're purchasing a condo, I mean, are you concerned that the condo building itself was built in the wrong spot, right? Or, you know, that would all be association stuff, right? That's not necessarily related to your client's decision to purchase their box in the air, right? So what would be the purpose of having an ILC or a survey deadline for a condo? You know, again, I want you to think about these contingencies that are in the contract. And if it's something that your client would actually use or not, and if it's not, then just remove that deadline from the contract, right? Even in many cases, when I'm writing my offer, if it's a home that's in a platted residential tract subdivision, right, I don't typically have an ILC survey deadline in there. Now, maybe if there's a shed, right, that's built on the property line, or, you know, if it's an acreage property with some janky fencing or whatever, right, maybe more important to have one of those deadlines in there. But if it's not something that your client is going to do, which you can ask them up front, are you going to get a survey or do you want an ILC? And if they're not going to do it, then don't put the deadline in your contract. It just makes your contract look weaker in comparison to other contracts where the buyer has specifically waived that contingent. Does that make sense to everybody?
Hey, Jesse.
Yeah,
Go
go ahead.
ahead, Bob.
Jesse, on the,
Oh, Bob, I guess Bob, go ahead.
on the seller side, if you receive information like that, or manuals for the appliances and so forth, should you counter that and take it out, make it easier, or just let it ride?
Yeah, so it typically, if I'm the seller, and there's a fine line here, right? If I have an otherwise acceptable offer that I really don't want to you know, even present the option of a counter offer and give the buyer the opportunity to walk away, right? Then I may not counter those things out of there. But if I'm countering everything else anyway, then I might just say, you know, in regards to section 10.6.1.2, there are no due diligence documents associated with the transaction. Now, that being said, if there's something that is an adverse material fact, I have a legal obligation to disclose that anyway, right? But I don't necessarily want to see a bunch of stupid documents that give a buyer a right to terminate later, right? Because if they're in there, right, let's say the owner's manual for the fridge, if they're in there and they've put a due diligence documents objection deadline in there, you know what that means? It means the buyer could literally say, hey, here's my notice to terminate, and it's based on the fact that we're not satisfied with the information found in the fridge, the owner's manual for the fridge. Well, if you don't want to give them that opportunity to terminate, then don't, you know, encounter and take that stuff out. But again, there's probably a low risk of them using that to terminate the contract. And so if I have an offer that's otherwise perfectly acceptable, and I don't want to give the buyer the option to walk away, then I'll just sign it, right?
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jesse.
You bet. Ann, did you have something?
Yeah, so, and I've not had this come up, but what if something came up in title and they were requiring an ILC? Is there something else in the somewhere else in the contract that would cover my client?
Yep. So let me just pull up the contract itself real quick here, and because this is something that is a huge misconception, and I see agents writing stuff, you know, in a weird spot all the time, and it's just because that's how they've been told to do it, but it's not accurate, and it really should be different. So let's talk about owner's extended coverage real quick. I can go into much more depth, and I'm not going to go crazy in depth here. But owner's extended coverage is in section 8, specifically 8.1.3. And if you don't know what owner's extended coverage is, it's basically a bonus portion to the title commitment. And it covers over certain things that a standard title commitment does not cover over. And one of those things you'll see right here is survey matters. So owner's extended coverage will cover over any issues that would theoretically be considered survey matters, right? And so typically title, if it's maybe an acreage property, if it's meets and bounds legal description, if it's a property that has a lot of, outbuildings and fencing or something like that, right? Title might say, hey, we need an ILC or some other form of survey in order to provide owners extended coverage, okay? Now, the caveat there is if title does say that and neither buyer nor seller want to pay for it, then what you can do in most cases, you can ask title and say, hey, can we remove number 3, the survey matters, from the owner's extended coverage and still get protection for items number 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6, right? And remove the requirement for the ILC or the survey. And that's perfectly acceptable. No party is obligated to pay or do anything else. But where you always see the agents writing it in is down here in section 9.1.2, right? And they come down here and they say, well, buyer or seller will pay, order, buyer or seller will pay. And then they'll put this verbiage in here that says only if required by title, or they'll say seller if required by title, or buyer if required by lender. Well, that's not what section 9 is asking. Section 9 is asking, regardless of whether title requires an ILC or a survey or not, right? Is an ILC or a survey, does the buyer want to have a contingency to do one whether it's required or not, right? And so you have to be really careful, especially if you have the seller, because if they check, let's say, the new ILC box, and then they say seller and seller, right? And forget about any verbiage that they put in here. Effectively, if you sign that offer, what you've said is, I, the seller, am going to order and pay for an ILC regardless of whether title requires it or not. And if you're going to put that verbiage in here, only if required by title, well, really you're referring to the owner's extended coverage, which is in a completely different section of our contract and should be addressed here. If you're going to do that, you can put other and say, seller if required by title, right? The lender almost never requires an ILC. I've had one deal in 13 years where that was a thing because there was a power line that was questionable as to whether it was too close to the house and with whether the house was in the easement for the power line or not. That was the only time the lender required an ILC. Typically, it would be title. And that being said, most cases, if it's a standard home in a platted subdivision, you're just not going to see it. So having it in the proper section, right, is important. If that's what your intent was, check the other box and put it here. But putting it down here, this is asking, what does the buyer want, regardless of whether it's required by anybody else or not? Okay. Does that make sense?
So just to be clear, best to just leave them blank.
Well, it just depends on what your
If it's land or something, but generally speaking.
Well, I mean, there might be cases when a buyer wants an ILC or a survey, right? I mean, I closed a deal that was in a platted subdivision where there was a shed that was built on top of an easement. Well, if they would have done an ILC, they would have turned that up, right? But at the end of the day, they had owner's extended coverage. And unfortunately, they didn't know that it was on top of the easement until they went to sell. And they sold through some other broker who had no idea what owner's extended coverage was. So they ended up coughing up like $2,500 or something to to remedy the situation.
Mm-hmm.
It had nothing to do with that one, but there might be a situation where they want to, and that's what section 9 is, hey, regardless of whether it's required or not, do you want one? And if your buyer says, no, I would never pay for it, I'm good with, roughly where the fence lines are and whatever else, then so be it. They just need to know they're not going to have any, coverage if there is no owner's extended coverage.
Gotcha.
Okay. Another thing, and this kind of ties into some of this stuff, is, not just the due diligence documents or, a particular deadline. Go through all of these, every single one of these is effectively a contingency in our contract, right? And so let's review these real quick, and I'll give you some things that you can think about. Okay? So, title, for instance, the title deadline. There are some hidden deadlines in our contract that you may or may not know about. Okay, and so if we go down to section 8.4, for instance, what 8.4 says is that if there's, if we receive some information a tax certificate showing that the property is included in a special taxing district, if that's received after the record title deadline, the buyer has until the earlier of closing or 10 days after receipt by the buyer to review and object to the property's inclusion in the special taxing district, right? And so, and same thing if you receive the title commitment after the deadline, right? You have until the earlier of closing or 10 days, right? So there's these hidden deadlines in our contract if you just go and read it. And so what you can do is you can squeeze all of your dates and deadlines down to a very short period if it's one of those types of deadlines where you have some built-in protection if you receive them after the deadline. Okay, so rather than leave our title deadline 7 days out, 10 days out, whatever, right? I can squeeze that down, right? Make the listing broker think I'm doing a nice favor to the seller by squeezing it down to 3 days, right? My contingency period is super tight, it is super short, but I know because I have actually read the contract that I have until the earlier of closing or 10 days after receipt of those documents to review and object to them. Okay, so they think, oh, you're squeezing your deadlines down super tight so that you don't have an ability to terminate after that. And really what you're doing is you're saying, hey, if I happen to get those documents after my 3-day period, then I have 10 days or up until closing, whichever's earlier. Okay, so you don't need to have a title deadline necessarily that's 10 days out, that's 14 days out. Shrink it down, squeeze it down, right? Because most brokers have no idea that there's this 10-day hidden deadline in our contract, okay? And so it's kind of a way that you can outsmart the other broker if they don't know that and they don't understand that, okay? Same thing with off-record title. Shrink it down because if they disclose something as an off-record matter, the buyer has time after they receive that to review and object to that, okay? So title deadlines, you can shrink those things down really far if you need to, okay? Association documents, same thing. Go read section 7, right? 7.4 is where you'll find the hidden deadline for association documents, okay? Public property disclosure, hopefully it's already uploaded, and then you can just put complete in here. Lead-based paint, again, if your client is not going to test for lead-based paint, then, I mean, still put a disclosure deadline in there. But as far as the lead-based paint termination, you can just waive it. If your client's not going to pay for it, then how would they know whether there's lead-based paint? Unless the seller has disclosed it, right? So waive it if your client is not going to use it, which is kind of one of the things that we talked about is don't create contingencies your buyer would never use. Now, if your buyer says, no, I don't want a contingency for lead-based paint, get it in writing, right? Hey, there could be lead-based paint in this home. I recommend that you have one, but if you want to make your offer more attractive, then we can certainly waive it, right? And then get confirmation from them. Hey, yep, nope, I'm good. Let's waive it. I'm not going to pay for a test. Okay. New loan application deadline. I'll typically put in process. I don't like complete there because, again, you can't truly have a completed loan application without a contract. So I'll typically put in process, or if you want to put MEC plus a certain number of days. I don't like to leave this hanging way out there. I just like to put in process, right? My client has already started it. We need a contract in order to truly have a completed loan application, okay? All right, new loan termination. So Charlton kind of hit on this and he said, hey, if your client is, you know, either let's say they're already through desktop underwriting and the lender has reviewed the conditional approval and looked at those conditions and said, yeah, no problem, like these should be easy to clear. Do you even need to put a new loan termination deadline in your contract? And the answer is no. You don't have to have a new loan termination deadline in your contract, okay? Now, what happens if the buyer loses their job over the course of being under contract on the home? Well, you lose your earnest money because you have no right to terminate based on the fact you now can't get the loan because you don't have a job, okay? But if you want to make it attractive and you're competing against a cash offer, what's attractive about a cash offer? They don't have a new loan termination deadline, right? And then we'll talk about appraisal, okay? And they don't have appraisal stuff. That's what's attractive about a cash offer, right? So if I can waive my new loan termination deadline because the buyer is just comfortable enough with where they stand, then so be it. But if they want to do that, again, get something in writing that says, hey, I'm okay, waiving this, right? I understand that if I can't get the loan, I'm going to lose my earnest money. So risky to do, but attractive to a seller, okay? We're not going to go over this stuff. This is buyers, if there's an existing loan that's going to be assumed or seller private financing stuff, not going to talk about that, okay?
Jesse, real quick.
Yep.
Do you think if the buyer is waiving the new loan termination and they end up losing their job, do you really think that any seller, like in your opinion, is going to keep that earnest money and say, sorry, dude? Or do you think that most people will say, God, that sucks, here's your earnest money? Do you know what I mean? Like it just seems.
Totally. And I will tell you that I would advise my clients to keep your earnest money. And it's not because I don't like you or I don't like the buyers, right? It's that I made a decision based upon the way that you wrote the offer, and you assumed the risk of writing your offer that way. And so, yes, if I had the seller, no offense, I would advise my seller to keep your earnest money.
Heartless.
I am. And that's my job as a seller's agent.
No,
Right?
I know.
And if you don't have the thick skin for that, like, I don't
What a
know.
meanie.
Yep, I know. I'm not a nice person, but this is why, this is why you can be dangerous with a contract, right? So know and understand how you write it, and know the consequences and advise your client accordingly. Okay. And that's why I say get a lot of this stuff in writing.
Hey, Jess.
Yep.
This falls back on the mantra of buyers are liars and sellers are thieves.
Yeah.
A buyer can say that he lost his job.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you get proof of that?
Yeah, I mean, call their employer if they're willing to give it to you. But I mean, the other thing, and one thing that is really important, especially if you're going to waive that new loan termination deadline, is that we as brokers still have a legal obligation to disclose adverse material facts, including adverse material facts regarding the buyer's finances. And so, if you're waiving that new loan termination deadline, you need to have something in writing, probably in your email to the listing broker, that says, hey, we are waiving our new loan termination deadline. We do have to get a loan to purchase the property, but we're comfortable enough with where we stand that we don't care to have a contingency. If the deal falls apart because of the loan, the buyers understand they're going to lose their earnest money. Okay. But yeah, I mean, and the other thing I'll tell you guys is that I've had, agents write offers as, 40% down, and then it turns out they're truly a 5% down payment, right? So yeah, buyers are liars and so are agents, right? Like that's why I say, like, would a seller really keep the earnest money? I would advise my seller to keep the earnest money because I don't know what the conversations you had with them were. I don't know the truth behind all of what you're saying, right? What I know is what I have written down on the contract that was agreed to by the buyer and seller, and that's what would hold up legally. So yes, I would feel bad. And at the same time, my clients made a decision. They took it off the market. Now they've got to go back onto the market, right? Maybe they don't get as good of an offer, whatever, right? All the future buyers are like, what's wrong with it? It fell apart because of inspections, yada, yada, right? Like, I don't know. My sellers probably have some damages there. And so, yes, I would advise them to keep your earnest money.
Jesse?
Yep.
Hey, when you say to get in writing, do you typically just shoot an email to the buyer asking for them to, hey, are you okay if, A, B, C, and D, or do you actually have a formatted letter that you
No, email's fine, right? I'm not as big a fan of text, just because what happens if you drop your phone in the toilet and you can't recover your text or whatever else, right? So email is just a little bit more permanent, right? Certainly don't do it over phone call, because how can you prove that? But yeah, get something in an email. You don't have to have like letterhead and handwritten letter or whatever. Just something in email showing, hey, I've advised you as to the pros and cons, and yes, you want to take this risk on yourself.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Appraisal. So here's the thing with appraisal, right? Is again, theoretically, if your client was willing, you could waive the appraisal deadline. And effectively what you're saying is, hey, if it doesn't appraise for my offer price, then I'm going to make up the difference, okay? If you're going to do that, then you don't put dates in here, okay? A little bit different if there's an appraisal gap with a cap on it, but if there is no cap, then you just waive your appraisal deadlines. You don't put deadlines in here and then go down to additional provisions and then say, hey, if the property doesn't appraise for the contract price, the buyer's going to bring the extra money to closing, right? Because if you have these dates and deadlines in here, that means that these sections apply. And if these sections apply, what it says is, if it doesn't appraise, then I have the following options. I can object, I can do notice to terminate, whatever, right? So you have one section of your contract, if you put dates and deadlines in here that says the terms and provisions of this section apply, right? And then you go down to additional provisions and say, I'm gonna, bring all the cash to closing if the appraisal is short. Well, which is it, right? If you're full on waiving the appraisal, then you don't put anything in here. You waive it, NA, deleted, whatever it is that you're gonna put in there, right? That's how you do that, is you wipe out your appraisal deadlines. Let's see, Kevin says, could you scroll up to number 7 through number 12 for dates and deadlines? Okay. Yeah, so right of first refusal basically through here. Do you have a question on one of those, Kevin?
No, I was just taking notes and I had to step away for a minute.
Okay, cool. Now, if you are going to do an appraisal gap clause, which has a cap on it, right? And effectively what you're saying is, hey, we offered 400,000. If it appraises for less than 400, we'll pay $10,000 over whatever it does appraise for, up to, not to exceed 400,000. Well, in that case, your cap is $10,000, right? And so you need to have some provision, some language in your provision that specifically addresses this. Because again, if you put a deadline in here, what it means is this provision applies. Okay, and so if you look at Damien's clause manual, which that was last week, if you need the recording, let myself or Harry know, we'll get that to you. Okay, but Damien's provisions have some language in there that modifies section 6.2, which is the appraisal. So it's super risky to flat out waive your appraisal deadlines. Better to put a cap on it so that your client is capped as to their losses. Now, the other thing that I will tell you is, this is truly in regards to a contingent sale deadline that this actual story happened, but the same thing theoretically could be true for appraisal. So let's say that rather than doing, let's say it's a $500,000 property with $5,000 is what in earnest money is what the listing broker has requested. Okay. Just because they've requested $5,000 doesn't mean that you have to offer $5,000. Okay. And so we had a deal where there was a conditional sale, right? The buyer had a conditional sale. They had to sell their property in order to purchase. And rather than the $10,000 in earnest money that the sellers were asking for, we negotiated the earnest money down to, I think it was $2,000, right? And then we waived our conditional sale. Now, again, we had to disclose that, hey, yes, we were waiving our conditional sale, right? But we do have to sell this property in order to purchase yours. However, by having $2,000 earnest money instead of $10,000, we're effectively cutting our losses if we couldn't get their home sold. So now apply that to the appraisal, right? Certainly you could shrink that. Now that might work against you by shrinking that earnest money, right? But if you shrink that earnest money and you waive your appraisal, right? You've said, hey, I'm not going to cap my losses as far as the appraisal. I'm going to pay whatever it is that, the difference between the appraised value and the purchase price. Okay. And then if that comes back and it's like $30,000 and your client's like, whoa, hey, I can't do it. Right. Well, now you've only lost $2,000 instead of $5,000 or $10,000, assuming that you didn't check the specific performance box, which I hardly ever want you to check the specific performance box. Okay. But assuming you did not check that, it's a liquidated damages contract. If you default, your earnest money is the extent of your losses. Okay. So if you can shrink the liquidated damages, which is the earnest money, and then use your appraisal, waive your appraisal deadline or your appraisal objection, right? Then you might shrink your losses if you have to terminate later while looking really good by waiving your appraisal objection. Does that make sense to everybody? Anybody have questions on that piece?
So Jesse, just to kind of, in my head, I'm thinking, so this is just to cover our buyer financially. It doesn't cover, like, they really want the house, but they can't afford to cover a $30,000 appraisal gap. It just gives them a less of a loss that they can't do. It doesn't really emotionally.
Yeah, I mean, in the thought process, right, is like, let's say I offered 500,000 and it's listed at 475, and the appraisal comes back at 470, right? Effectively, that means my client's bringing $30,000 to the table based on the way that I wrote my contract. If I flat out waive my appraisal, well, if the buyer isn't willing to do that, and I shrunk the earnest money down to $2,000, right? Then effectively I could say, hey, sorry, man, we can't do the 30,000. We'll cut our losses at 2,000 and just walk away and default under the terms of the contract. Or, if you don't want to go back to square one, now you already have, an appraisal. We've gotten through inspections and whatever else, right? If you want to just keep the deal moving forward, which in many cases they just have to do because now they're under contract on a new property that they don't want to lose or whatever, effectively it opens up an option for you to now renegotiate the purchase price because your client would otherwise walk away from the $2,000 of their losses, and now the seller has to start from square one. Right?
Okay.
So yeah, good question. Other questions on that piece? Okay. We already talked about new ILC or survey deadline. Not going to cover that again. So inspection. A couple things. One is the reason that the real estate commission, when they redid the contract to buy and sell, the reason they added this inspection termination deadline is so that the buyer could waive their inspection objection, and therefore they would not need an inspection resolution deadline either, right? So you could waive those two and keep your inspection termination if you wanted it, right? And so effectively what you're saying is, I have no right to object under the inspection clause. My only option is to terminate or move forward with the deal, okay? And all of those garbage inspection clauses that you see, oh, this is, limited to the, health and safety items, major structural issues, whatever, they're all trash, okay? Those clauses are all garbage. If the buyer has a deadline here, then what that means is the provisions of this section apply, okay? So they could put in there, hey, yeah, this is limited to health and safety and major structural issues or whatever. And then they could throw the kitchen sink at you and just stick you with all the little dumb things that come up on the inspection, okay? The way that we, get around that is we waive our objection, we waive our resolution, preserve our termination. Now, all of that being said, if your only right is to terminate and your buyer does the inspection, right? And it needs a new furnace, and your buyer says, hey, that's more than I'm willing to chew. Can you go talk to the listing broker and tell them our only right is to terminate, therefore we are going to terminate unless the seller is willing to do the furnace. So even if that is the case, there may still be an opportunity for some negotiation, okay? But that is the reason that they added this deadline, is so that we can say, we're not going to object to anything, therefore we don't need a resolution. Our option is terminate or move forward. Now, let me throw a curveball at you. There might be some inspectors out there who you might be able to get to go to the showing with you, who might be willing to do a limited inspection on the major items of the property anyway, and not provide you with a written report, who might do that for a discount compared to their full-on inspection cost, okay? I'm not going to tell you who those are. So go network with your inspectors and see if that's something they'd be willing to do. Because if they will, what you can do if your client is reasonably sure that they're going to be submitting an offer is you can set it up for a time that works for your inspector, right? And it's going to have to be short notice. So again, talk to some inspectors who maybe have a little bit of flexibility on their schedules, run this by them and say, hey, if I need you on short notice to do a limited inspection to the major components of the property, no written report, right? You're just going to go with us for our showing and go inspect the major components of the property. And we got to be out in 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour or whatever it is. Take the inspector with you, spend the money at the time of your showing, knowing that there's a chance you may not get your offer accepted and you could be wasting your money. But if you want to make your offer look competitive, take your inspector with you, pay them $150 or whatever it is that they're going to charge you, right? And then waive all of your inspection deadlines. And rather than waive, I might put complete, right? We've already completed our inspections. I'm not wanting these provisions to be deleted. I'm just saying we've already completed it. We have no objections to the things that have turned up on the inspection. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay.
Then if they've got some adverse effect that they know about that you inspector may have missed, they'd still need to provide that, right?
Well, if they know about it, right? The legal obligation is they have to disclose adverse material facts about which they actually know. But does every seller know every adverse material fact about their property? They may not. So there may still be things that turn up on the inspection that you never knew about, right? And if the inspector catches it, then you got to address that with your buyer. Hey, do you still want to move forward on this property? Do you want to waive your inspection but put in additional provisions, right? That the seller agrees to, you know, have the furnace replaced or whatever it is, right? So there's different ways that you can handle that. But just know that there's some options. Go network with your inspectors and see who's willing to do what, okay?
Hey, Jesse.
Yep.
I just want to clarify, when you remove the objection and the resolution deadline, but you leave in that termination, there's something significant, like you said, the furnace that's wrong with the house, there is a small chance that there's the ability to negotiate that, but it's removing those little nitpicky items like the light bulbs out and the door handles loose, things like that.
Well, you could still terminate based on the light bulbs out and the door handles, right? I mean, if you preserve your right to terminate based on inspection stuff, then you preserve your right to terminate based on inspection stuff, regardless of whether it's, you know, big items, nitpicky items or whatever, right? So not 100% true, but that's the intent that you're trying to convey.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Property insurance termination deadline. How long does it take someone to go talk to an insurance provider? Do you need 15 days in a multiple offer situation? Or can you be reasonably sure that you can get a reasonable quote for insurance within 3, 4, 5 days? Shrink it down. You don't need the 15 if it's, you know, multiple offer situation, right? Shrink it down. Know that there's going to be a lot happening in a short period of time. Okay. Due diligence documents we already talked about. If your clients aren't going to object to any of the crap that you wrote in there, then don't put it in. Just leave it blank, NA, deleted, whatever you're going to put. Okay. The conditional sale deadline. So again, ignore these notes, right? These notes are like a general template. We're not talking about a crazy competitive situation. Okay. If you're in a competitive offer situation and your client has a $350,000 house to sell in Fort Collins, right, are you reasonably confident that hopefully you can get that sold and be able to close by the closing date? Well, I mean, you never know what's going to come up on inspections and appraisal and whatever else, right? And there's always a chance that your, you know, buyer's their current home that they need to sell, there's always a chance that it could die, right? That deal could die. And now your earnest money is at risk, right? But if I'm reasonably confident and the buyer is like, hey, this is the house for me, I don't want to miss it, okay? Then waive your conditional sale deadline as well. Now, again, we have to disclose adverse material facts about the buyer's finances, which would include that, yes, they have to sell the home. However, we aren't adding the contingency into our contract. So I've disclosed to you that yes, they have to sell. However, I'm advising that I'm telling you, if our deal doesn't close on or before the time this closes, then we're going to lose our earnest money. And my buyers are prepared to do that. Okay. The basic termination deadline we talked about. Closing, figure out what's important for the sellers, right? Possession. Does the seller need some post-closing occupancy or do they not? If they need post-closing occupancy, are your buyers willing to do that for free or for, you know, a significantly discounted rate or whatever rate? The more attractive that you can make the post-closing, if that's what they need, the better. Okay. So consider post-closing occupancy stuff. Know all of your hidden dates and deadlines in the contract. So just some examples. We'll look at section 7.4, 8.2, 8.3, 8.4, right? All of those things have hidden deadlines in them, and that's not the exhaustive list. So go find your hidden deadlines and know which ones are in our contract that would allow you to shrink these deadlines way down, right? And still protect the buyer if there's something out there that gets disclosed after the fact, or like the title commitment, not necessarily disclosed, but gets delivered after the fact. Okay. Let's see. In some cases, the seller may not want to put their home on the market because they fear that they may not be able to find a replacement home in a tight market, right? How many of you have been working with sellers and they say, hey, like, we're pretty much ready to sell, but the inventory is crazy tight and I don't want to list my home until we can go under contract on something else, right? That's a real thing, particularly in a tight market. And so what you might do, if you know, again, through your communication with the listing broker, if you know that the seller has to find a replacement property and they're just not comfortable accepting an offer, you know, without some kind of provision, add, instead of a conditional sale deadline, add a conditional purchase deadline. Okay. And Damien has a clause in Damien's clause manual for a conditional purchase deadline. Okay. You think that provides the seller with a little bit of comfort that, hey, I don't have to move twice because I have an option to kill our deal, right? If I can't find a replacement property. Now, stuff to consider there is, when do your dates and deadlines start if the seller has the option to terminate this contract because they haven't found the replacement property? Does the buyer want to go spend money on inspections and appraisal and all that other stuff? If the buyer has, or if the seller has 30 days to kill the deal because they haven't found a conditional purchase, you know, a replacement property. Okay, so consider adding a conditional purchase deadline into your contract. Obviously, price, right? Price is probably the biggest indicator. But at the end of the day, if we're listed at 400,000, it doesn't do me any good to have an offer of $1 million if it's a financed offer with no appraisal gap, right? So it's not all price, but certainly price comes into it. Concessions. If you're asking for concessions in a multiple offer situation, you're probably just not going to get the deal. So consider finding an alternative to asking for concessions, okay? Earnest money. Earnest money, you know, I have a love-hate relationship with earnest money, right? I mean, does a $20,000 earnest money deposit put any more money in the seller's pocket than a $2,000 earnest money deposit? The answer is no, unless the buyer defaults under the terms of the contract, right? But if the buyer's not going to default, then earnest money doesn't matter, right? It doesn't change the seller's bottom line. It just changes how much cash at closing or new loan the buyer is going to bring, okay? So you could certainly make that earnest money a larger amount if you want. You can also make it a smaller amount if you're trying to offset some of your contingencies that maybe you've waived, right? But earnest money is certainly something that you could, you know, use to work to your advantage. Closing date obviously makes sense to most people. What works as far as closing? Again, you might have some sellers who say, hey, I need the property for, you know, 60 days after closing. Well, if that's the case, you can either, you know, do, let's say, a 90-day close, or you can do a 30-day close with 60 days of post-closing, right? And as a seller, it's probably more comfortable for me to do the 30-day close with 60-day post-closing instead of just doing a 90-day close, right? Because then I know that after 30 days, you've purchased the property, and now if you lose your job, that's not my problem. The house is already sold, right? Inclusions and exclusions. So only ask for what the seller is willing to leave, right? If they're wanting to take the fridge and the washer and the dryer, then writing them into your contract probably hurts your clients, right? And on the flip side, you might even ask if there's things that the sellers just don't want to deal with, right? Hey, if there's a bunch of crap in the house that you don't want to move out, my clients are happy to deal with it. We'll get a dumpster if we have to, or we'll sell it on Marketplace, or we'll keep it, right? Whatever it is, that might be attractive for the sellers. In my home that I live in right now, the sellers were downsizing from a 4,500 square foot home to a 1,000 square foot condo in Florida. They're moving to Florida and buying a condo, right? They didn't have room in their condo for, their dining room set, the china hutch, their treadmill, all these other things. And we were in a multiple offer situation. And we said, hey, tell you what, just give us a list of all the crap you don't want to deal with. And assuming that's okay, we will deal with that later, right? So that was attractive to them to be able to leave a bunch of stuff that normally you wouldn't see. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, how would you write that into your contract and the provisions?
Well,
or would you write it in the inclusions or exclusions?
Well, so if you write it into the inclusions, what you have to be careful of is, the lender may not like that, okay? Because the lender is lending on the real property, not the personal property. And so they might be okay if you include a clause that says, all of these things are being left at the convenience of the seller and they're assumed to have no contributory value to the value of the property, right? And so effectively what you're saying is, I'm not paying extra for this stuff. I'm just making it convenient for the seller and it has no effect on the value, okay? You could certainly do a personal property agreement, which is a new, form that came out, I think, in 2019. So you could do a personal property agreement and put it all in there and then have a dollar value associated with those items, okay? So there's different ways you can do it. You could certainly do it via email if your buyer just says, hey, I don't care whatever they want to leave. I really don't care to have anything in the contract in writing and agree to. If they leave it, great. If they don't, that's okay too, right? And the sellers may have the same, desire and say, hey, I don't want to cloud up our offer and get the lender pissed off. Let's just put it in an email and we'll all shake hands. And if it goes away, great. And if it doesn't, that's okay too.
Okay, perfect.
One thing as far as post-closing goes, back to post-closing, just know that we can only use the post-closing occupancy agreement for a period of up to 60 days. If it's longer than 60 days, they need to prepare a lease, and there is no standard lease form, meaning we as brokers cannot draft that agreement. That needs to be drafted by the parties or the parties' attorneys, right? So post-closing up to 60 days. Okay, other stuff. So one of the things that you certainly can do, normally we don't, but one of the things that we can do is we can have the buyer select the title insurance company and pay for the title commitment. How much is an average title commitment? I don't know, $1,000, $1,200, right? That certainly can make your offer look a little bit more attractive. Obviously, it's going to add to, your client's closing costs or their loan amounts if they're rolling closing costs into the loan or whatever, right? One thing that you certainly could do is, that there is no option here that says that the seller will pick and the buyer will pay, right? And so if you're going to do that, you could say you go down to additional provisions and say, in regards to section 8.1, right, the seller is going to pick the title company and the buyer is going to pay. Okay, you think that might be attractive to the listing broker and give you a little bit of sway, right? Compared to all the other offers, says, hey, listing broker, we're willing to work with, the title company that you've selected, and we're also willing to pay for it. Okay, so you could certainly do that, or you could just check the box that says the buyer selects the title insurance company and the buyer's going to pay, and then you just pick the same title company, right? Other little stuff, we could install carbon monoxide detectors for the seller if they're missing, right? That's a Colorado law. That is not just code. It is a law in the state of Colorado. Carbon monoxide detectors have to be within 15 feet of every bedroom, unless some very, limited cases, which we're not going to talk about. But if they're missing carbon monoxide detectors, throw them in there, right? It's just one of those little things that will set you apart, right? But if you're not looking for those things at your showing, then you're not going to know, right? So you got to be looking at these things up front. There's a section in our contract that talks about who's going to determine the time and place of closing. Well, if you don't really care, then let the seller pick the time and place of closing. Again, probably has no impact on your buyer, and it makes it, the seller feel good that, hey, they're not dogging us, they're not gonna whatever, right? I get to pick that. As far as the deed goes, section, I think it's 13, right? Our contract now defaults to a special warranty deed unless you've selected some other type of deed. So we used to always select general warranty deed, which is still okay to ask for. But if you check the box that says, hey, yeah, special warranty deed, you're still going to get a title commitment, right? And you're still going to see the condition of title as far as title is concerned. So all you're really saying is, I'm not going to pursue the seller if there's a defect from before the seller's ownership period. Okay. And probably the chances of there being title defects is, I don't know, maybe 1%. I mean, I think I've done 2 deals over 13 years where we've had title related issues. Okay. So relatively low risk. Check the special warranty deed. Okay. As far as the closing services fee, who's going to pay for that? Well, it's almost always half and half. But what, is there anything that says it can't all be paid by the buyer? You're going to eat $150, $200, whatever the closing services fee is. You're going to eat the seller's half. Again, it's not a lot, at least in comparison to a $400,000 house, but it just makes your offer stand out as, hey, I'm not just doing half and half because that's what we've always done. I'm setting myself apart by paying, having the buyer pay for this, or heck, have the broker pay for it. I don't care, right? But you're not asking the seller to pay anything there. Same thing with status letter and transfer fees for the HOA. There's no standard here, guys. So if the buyer is able and willing to take this on, then have the buyer take that stuff on. It doesn't have to just be, half and half, or the seller does one and the buyer does the other. Same thing for owner's extended coverage, right? We already talked about what OEC is a little bit, but owner's extended coverage, typically we always ask the seller to pay for it. Well, it's $75, $80. It's not that big of a deal. But again, if your buyer is able and willing to do it, then you can check the buyer box. It's perfectly okay to check a box just because, and not have to check the, seller, because that's what you've always seen everybody else do. Okay. Taxes. So taxes don't necessarily have to be prorated at the most recent mill levy. So if taxes have gone up, right, it's certainly appropriate to prorate taxes based on the preceding year. Okay, you could also do a flat fee of $2,000 when the taxes were $5,000, right? It doesn't have to be the most recent mill levy just because that's what we always do, right? You could certainly say, hey, there's going to be no proration for taxes. We will just assume the full tax bill for the full year, right? And that's obviously going to be costly if you're closing in, say, December or something like that. But if you're closing in January, February, it's not going to cost you that much to assume the taxes for 2 months worth of the transaction. That makes sense to everybody?
So I didn't catch that, Jesse. Sorry. I did, but what box did you say to check?
Well, you could check other, right? I mean,
Okay,
it gives us 2 standard. One is, hey, taxes for the calendar year immediately preceding closing. The other one is the most recent mill levy and valuation, right? Or if you want to just say, hey, there's not going to be any proration for taxes. The buyer's just going to assume all of the taxes for that year, then check the other box, right? Again, it's and depending on when you close in the year will dictate how much taxes your buyers are going to eat if you're going to do that. Okay. The per diem fee, right? Like sometimes you see $300, $500 per day in here. Well, you know, again, if the seller's still living in the property, what if, you know, they end up running into some issue where, you know, it takes them a few extra days, right? Shrinking the amount of that per diem fee is maybe more attractive to a seller who might think that they're in a tight spot as far as, am I going to be able to actually do this or am I not, right? You don't have to do 300 because that's what everybody else does. You put 50. Now, again, we have to advise our buyer that, hey, if we put $25 per day or $50 per day, does that really cover your, you know, your losses if the seller after closing fails to deliver possession of the property? Oh,
So Jesse, could
Yeah.
you put $25 and then down in additional provisions, put for number 17, $25 for the first 10 days and then 300 for every day after?
yep, 100% doable.
Okay.
Okay, let's get into some of the like advanced, really juicy stuff. Okay. One of the things that you can do is ask and this assumes that your buyer is a financed offer as opposed to a cash offer, right? Ask the listing broker who their preferred lender is and go tell your buyers to use them. Okay. Do you think that might help the listing broker feel more comfortable about your buyer's pre-approval status? Yeah, I mean, if the listing broker's preferred lender is the one that's going to do it, right? And you can even write it into the offer. Hey, you know, this contract is contingent upon the buyer using XYZ lender, and if they don't, they'll be considered to be in default. Seller can terminate the contract and keep the earnest money. Right? Make sure your buyer's willing to do that. But that's one thing that has been big for me is, you know, A, if a buyer is willing to use my preferred lender and I'm the listing broker, or B, if I'm the buyer and I can get that from the listing broker and say, buyer, go use these people. If their fees are close and their rates are close, right, and this is what it takes to get you into a home, that might carry a lot of weight with the listing broker. Okay. Kind of the nuclear option, which again, I really strongly recommend that you don't ever do, is specific performance box. Specific performance does not mean that your buyer cannot terminate the contract, right? All specific performance means is if the buyer is in default, then the seller can not only keep the earnest money, but they can also sue you for specific performance or damages or both. Okay. Now, damages can stack up really quickly, and that's like attorney's fees and all these other garbage legal fees, right? And so in most cases, it's not a good idea to do that unless you have an extremely sophisticated buyer, but use that as your nuclear option is specific performance, okay? Let's see. Have your buyer get a home warranty for the seller that covers the seller during the listing period, right? That way, if there's something that goes wrong on the property while the home is listed, but prior to closing, it's not going to have to come out of the seller's pocket. You are providing that coverage for them in the form of a home warranty that will cover the listing period itself. Again, not going to tell you who the home warranty companies are that do that or don't do that. Go network with your home warranty people. Okay. Let's see. So some other stuff, you know, that you can
write that into the contract, or do you just do it?
Yep, you write it straight into the contract. And because obviously you're not going to do it if the offer is not accepted, right? Okay. Some other stuff that, you know, is some out of the box type stuff. Offer the seller something that is unrelated to the real estate or this particular contract itself. Right? And some of the creative stuff that I've seen is like, hey, the buyer owns this Airbnb up in Vail, right? And you can have 3 days worth of, you know, 3 nights stay at the buyer's Airbnb if you accept our contract. Okay.
That's in the email, right?
Well, you
That's
can
not-
certainly you can put it into the contract, right? As long as the lender is okay with that, as long as
Okay,
everybody
okay,
else
that's
is
where I
okay
was-
with that. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Other weird stuff that I've seen, right? Offering a discount at the buyer's work, right? Hey, seller, if you want a discount at, our, whatever business I own, right? Then you can take that discount, or you can have up to $250 credit at my work or whatever. Now be careful about doing that. If your buyer is not a business owner, make sure that your client has the ability to legally offer that type of incentive, right? But think outside the box, right? What else can I throw at them that might be of interest to them that's not necessarily related to the deal? Okay. Here's one that has really been successful with some of my clients. Let's say we're talking about a $500,000 house with $5,000 earnest money, right? So what I do is I say, hey, yes, here's your $5,000, right? And then in additional provisions, you can say, of the $5,000 earnest money, 2,000 or 1,000 or whatever the number is, but let's say 2,000. 2,000 of it will be paid directly to the seller and will be non-refundable if the buyer terminates the contract in conjunction with the inspection, the appraisal, new loan termination, whatever. Now, I don't want you to say that $2,000 will be non-refundable and leave it at that, right? Because what happens if the house burns down? What happens if there's a flood? What happens if it gets condemned? What happens if the seller just decides to default, right? And not sell you the property? Well, your intent wasn't that the seller just got to keep $2,000 in that case. But of the $5,000, $2,000, if I terminate for inspections, appraisal, financing, right? Whatever other provisions you want to lump in there or take out, right? 2,000 will be non-refundable if the buyer terminates in conjunction with sections 10.2, 10.3, whatever other sections they are you're talking about. Okay. And effectively what that tells the seller is you have $2,000 on the line no matter what. And so there's a lot of motivation for you not to lose that $2,000 and continue moving forward and get this deal to closing. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Include a cover letter with your offer, okay? And dumb it down, because there's a lot of dumb agents out there who just don't understand some of these advanced tactics. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say dumb, but there's a lot of agents who just don't understand some of these advanced tactics and the way that you write your contract, the way that you do, right? And so make that cover letter very clear. Hey, we waived our inspection objection and we're waiving our resolution. We're just preserving our termination. The reason for that is we're effectively saying we have no right to object to anything, right? Not even, health and safety, not structural, right? If there's something that's so crazy wrong, we have a right to terminate and walk away, or otherwise we're just moving forward, okay? So include a cover letter with highlighting, especially stuff if it's not common stuff that you would typically see in an offer. If you're using some of these advanced tactics, right? Tell them why you wrote your offer the way that you wrote your offer. Okay. We talked about escalation clauses. Did we talk about escalation clauses? I can't remember. No. Let's talk about them real quick. And these are more common. These are not things that are like super uncommon. So an escalation clause is effectively where you say, hey, our offer is $400,000, but we'll go $1,000 over any other offer up to a maximum of $420,000, let's say. Okay. So in most cases, it makes sense to put a cap on that escalation clause, right? Because, if my client only qualifies up to 420, then what happens if they get an offer at 430, right? And I didn't put a cap on my escalation clause. Now what that means is they've accepted my offer and I'm now under contract at 431, which I can't qualify for. Okay. So put a cap on your escalation clause unless your buyer is just sophisticated enough and has the financial ability to actually not cap your escalation clause. The other thing is you might have a tiered escalation clause that says, hey, we'll do $1,000 over any financed offer and $5,000 over any cash offer.
Wow.
Okay. So, you know, and the reason you might do that, right? The question that we get all the time is, how do I compete with financing against a cash offer? Well, make it more attractive than a cash offer, right? I'm willing to take $5,000 and roll the dice on your contingency for financing instead of just taking a cash offer. Now, maybe that's not juicy enough for some people. Maybe it's $10,000 over any cash offer, whatever, right? You can flex the numbers as you see fit for your situation and what your buyer's willing to do, but you might actually have a tiered escalation clause, okay? The other thing that I'll tell you in conjunction with escalation clauses is don't use round numbers. Because if you and everybody else on the planet says, I'll pay you $1,000 over any other offer, well, what if you both come in with $1,000 over any other offer, right? Maybe you make it $1,250 or $1,600 or whatever, right? But using $1,000, that's what everybody else does too. So if you both cap out at 420 and you both have $1,000 over any other offer, and otherwise everything else was the same and the seller's just trying to decide between the two, if instead you had said 1,250, well, now you might have a $250 advantage, right? So don't use round numbers. Let's see, appraisal gap. We've talked ad nauseum about appraisal gap. You guys have questions, let me know. Love letters. So do not accept love letters as the listing broker. That being said, if you are the buyer's broker and you can use it to your advantage and you think it will work in your favor, then by all means, go ahead and write a love letter and see if the seller is willing to, read your note that tugs at the heartstrings and whatever else. But I don't ever want you to accept a love letter from a buyer's broker if you're the listing broker, okay? Ask about being in a backup position. Guys, the reality is that in many cases, in a multiple offer situation, your offer may not be the one that gets accepted. And there is so much pressure on buyers waiving all of these contingencies, right, for a buyer to walk away from a deal. And so if you can lock down a backup offer that automatically moves into first position upon the termination of the first contract, right, then that might be a good option for you. And I've closed deals out of backup position before. So does it work every time? Absolutely not. Is it a real possibility, especially when you have so much pressure on buyers right now who are paying crazy amounts over, right, have these crazy escalation clauses, these crazy appraisal gap clauses? There's a much higher likelihood that buyers will default. So if you can take, if you can get into a backup position, then by all means do it. Now, if you're going to do that, there's kind of two edges of this sword, right? Do you have a right to go pursue other properties while you're in a backup position, or do you not? Well, if you don't write that into your provision, the answer is no, you do not. Okay, even though you're in a backup position, you cannot terminate just because you found another property that you like better.
Unless you write it in.
Unless you write it into your contract.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And I see some faces of people who are like, oh crap, I've done that before. And that's okay if the seller lets you out, but technically you were in default if the seller wants to fight you on it. Okay. So
Hey,
write
Jesse.
that into your backup offers if you need to, if you're going to be pursuing other properties. But know that it also potentially weakens your position if the seller knows that you're just going to be out looking at other stuff too, right? They might want you as a backup and not want you to go away. I think there was a question, someone chimed in.
Yeah, I had a question about the love letters.
Okay.
I thought that the Real Estate Commission came out with a position they didn't want us writing love letters anymore. Could you just clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, so like I said, certainly from a seller's perspective, I would not accept a love letter. And even if they send it through with the offer, I would absolutely not present that to the seller, because I don't want the seller to use that in conjunction with their decision of, hey, I chose this offer because, you know, the people who wrote the love letter were part of this protected class, and I'm not, you know, that's not my thing, whatever, right? So, you know, I think part of the real estate commission, right, they don't want buyers, brokers pushing the listing broker to present those, which is why they're saying don't write them either. But there's certainly much less risk associated with having a buyer write a love letter than having a seller accept that love letter. And most smart brokers will not accept love letters anyway. So I don't want you to like hang your hat on the love letter that's going to lock it down for you. And it may or may not be effective, but again, certainly from a seller's perspective, avoid it. From a buyer's perspective, there's much less risk, right?
Okay, so just to clarify, it is okay if we did that. Legally, we'd be fine if we wrote one. And also legally, we'd be fine if we did not present it to our seller.
Well, a couple of things. One is you should never write it, right? If the buyer is going to write it, then yes, okay, let the buyer write it, right? Now, again, that could work against you, because what happens if you write the love letter and you're like, oh, you know, my family, you know, we have good Christian morals, right? And we'll be great family for the neighborhood. And the seller's like, yeah, dude, I'm an atheist and I think that your fake God is garbage. Like, I don't want to take your offer. And I'm not saying that against anybody. I'm just throwing it out there, right? Like, I'm a religious person too. So you got to be careful about those love letters, right? Especially if you get into protected class stuff, right? It could work against you if the listing broker ends up actually presenting it. So you should never write it. If the buyer writes it and, you know, wants you to present it to the seller, great. Now, if you're the listing broker and a buyer's broker sends you a love letter in conjunction with their offer, you are 100% within your rights to not present it, right? And probably you should have that discussion with your seller up front, or get something in writing from them when you get the love letter with the offer, and just say, hey, I got the love letter. Here's the issue with these love letters is that if I present it to you and then, you know, even if you choose not to accept that offer based on the price, let's say, if the buyer deems that you used some, you know, form of protected class to make your decision, you might be facing a fair housing lawsuit, right? And so rather than put you in a position of even opening you up to the possibility, I'm just going to not present it to you. Are you okay with that, right? And then just get it in writing. Yeah, I'm okay with that. Okay, great. I have no obligation to present it to you. You get sneaky brokers who think they're smart and they'll put it as an attachment to the contract. And again, if you have had that discussion with the sellers and they're okay with it, then you are well within your rights to not present it. And if if it helps you, you can put in a counter offer or something. You know, the buyer's love letter is not going to be attached to this contract at the seller's discretion, right? Or at the seller's direction or whatever. That makes sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Do you need to let the opposite party know that you're not presenting the love letter to hey, I'm not going to present, I don't think it's in your best interest for me to present this to them or something like that? Do you need to let the opposite party know that you're not?
So some brokers in the listing service will actually put in the broker's comments, no love letters, right? But at the end of the day, like any good broker who knows and understands the risks associated with it, they're not going to be presenting it. So, I guess the conversation to have with your buyer is, hey, you might write this love letter. You might take the time to write this love letter, and they may not even present it, right? So just, again, like, don't get too wrapped up in the weeds on this. The bottom line, what I want you guys to know is don't ever take a love letter if you're the listing broker. If you're the buyer's broker, I don't do it, guys, just because I don't like it. Again, like, for me, it's a business decision. It's a business transaction. I don't care what your buyer looks like. I don't care what their family is or isn't like, right? I don't care if they have kids and if they're going to be a, great fit for the neighborhood and anything else, because I'm moving out of the neighborhood. Right? And yes, I like my neighbors and everything else, but I don't like my neighbors more than I like myself. And I'm sorry if that makes me self-centered or anything else. Okay. But it's a business decision for me, and it shouldn't play into that. So I don't advise my buyers to do it either. Okay. But some buyers want to do it. If they do, then just let them know there's a chance that it may not get presented anyway. And even if they write the, best love letter that pulls at those heartstrings, there's still a chance the offer may not get accepted regardless. Right.
So Jesse.
Yep.
My creative brain is going.
Perfect. This is how we get sued.
So what if because I've told my buyers not to write a love letter. Like, they keep pushing it because they're from out of state. They receive love letters with their offers in their state, blah, blah, blah. And so I told them, like, you can't write a love letter here. It just doesn't happen. Well, now, since you've shown me the introduction to the thank you cards for showing me your house, what if they were to sneak in their little love letter with the thank you card? And should I be none the wiser?
Well, plausible deniability is not a defense in court, right? So, if from a legal perspective, it doesn't help you if you know that they're doing it and you're like, well, I didn't read it, right? It doesn't help you any. I think you have very limited liability as the buyer's broker anyway, especially if you have something in writing that says, hey, I advise you not to do it. And again, guys, I don't like it. I'm not advising you to do it. I'm just saying it's an option. It's out there. But I would rather keep it professional, because the other thing that you have to keep in mind is if the listing broker feels like you're putting them in a position of liability, right, then I don't want to work with you either. So be careful about how you advise it. And that's why I say I don't advise it, is I don't want the listing broker to feel like they have to provide it and somehow put themselves in a position where they may be opening themselves up to fair housing, violations or anything like that. So I wouldn't do it. I love the thank you notes, for showings, where they truly stay professional and, short and sweet. Hey, thank you so much for letting us see your house. We know that showings are probably crazy right now, and it means a lot to us that you let us in to take a look. Your house is beautiful. We really hope to be able to work, on a smooth deal with you. Thanks a lot, right? Like, keep it short, keep it sweet, right? And that's it, in my opinion. So,
Jesse, the buyer will never know that you did not present a love letter to the seller. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, just be careful. I mean, if they're directing you to do it as the buyer's broker and they want you to do it and you don't do it, I think you're just putting yourself in a position that's not a good position to be in. So I counsel my clients not to do it. I'm right there with you, Brandy. I tell them, no, it's not good. We could be putting the sellers in a position where they could be getting sued, which, is a lot of pressure for a seller. And if if there's that kind of pressure on the seller, they may say, I don't want to work with you regardless, right? That makes sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
So Jesse, can I go back to backup offers just for a second?
Yep.
So I see the negative if you put in there that you have the right to go look at other houses and blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And that can be a deterrent for the seller, right? But if you don't do that, then it's a deterrent for the buyer because he can't go out and look for other homes. And if that house does go through, then you've just wasted 2 to 3 weeks, right?
Or more. Yeah, totally.
Or more. So, do you advise your clients to put in backup offers? I mean, this is a crazy market, right? But what if that home that you have that buyer that really wanted it, the offer looks good and the agent says, oh yeah, they got a ton of money and blah, blah, blah. How would you then advise your buyer?
Well, yeah. So I like the backup offer situation just because, again, knowing that there is so much pressure on the first position buyer to perform, right? It just is too much for a lot of buyers, right? And they say, hey, I just have to kill this deal. I bit off more than I can chew. by, whatever. And so if I can get my client into a backup position, absolutely, I'll advise them to do that. Now, the flip side of this, and this, you guys have probably heard my soapbox about backup offers, and if you haven't, so if I'm on the listing side, the seller side, right, there's a misconception about backup offers, right? And so typically the way the misconception goes, right, is, hey, we're going to take our first, our best offer, and we're going to accept that as our first position offer. And then we're going to take our next best offer and we're going to take that as our backup offer, right? And if that's what they choose to do, that's fine. And I'll tell you, if you're doing that, you're doing backup offers wrong. Okay?
Right.
Really, the only reason that you should take a backup offer is if it puts you in a position of leverage against your first position offer. And effectively what that means is your backup offer needs to be better than your first position offer. And so initially right up front, right, when you end up with 10 offers, you're going to take your best offer, and then you're not going to take anything else. And the only way you'll take a backup offer is if something else comes in that's better, right? And the reason for that is you're under contract at 400 with your first position offer, right? And your next best offer is 395. And let's say you were listed at 380. Well, certainly 395 is still an acceptable offer, right? However, if the furnace needs to be replaced and the furnace is $4,000, you're still better off working with your $400,000 buyer and replacing the $4,000 furnace than you would be to drop down to a $395,000 offer, right? Now, if some other offer were to come in at $405,000, $405,000, and turns out buyer number one says, hey, it needs a new furnace, right? Well, I'm going to tell buyer number one, hey, go pound sand, because if you don't want it, I'm going to bump up to $405,000. And even if I have to replace a $4,000 furnace for them, I'm still in a better position than I would have been if I just accepted your $400,000, right? And had to replace a furnace. So, and people say, well, I don't want the backup position buyer to go out and look at other stuff, right? Well, most backup clauses have a provision that allows the buyer to terminate and go look at other properties anyway. And so if you had accepted that $395,000 offer and the buyer had in their backup clause that they had a right to go look at other stuff anyway, well, by the time your first offer falls apart, right, they've been out looking at other stuff anyway, and maybe they've found something else. And so there was no point really in holding it regardless. And on the flip side, by not holding it, you're still, as the listing broker, you're going to go and you're going to call all of the other agents who submitted offers on the property or who had showed interest in the property and say, hey, my first deal's starting to look shaky. Are you interested if this deal falls apart? And if they are, great. And if they're not, you didn't miss anything because they would have disappeared by that point anyway. Does that make sense to everybody?
Hey,
So
Jesse.
I still think it's critical though, that you put, if you're representing the buyer, that you want to be able to add something that says they can look for another house, only that it gives you options as on the buyer side.
Maybe. I mean, it depends on the buyer's situation. If they have the ultimate flexibility and they live in mom and dad's basement and they can wait until next year.
That's right.
Then again, if I want to make it as competitive as possible, right, I might put my backup offer in with no right to terminate, unless and until the other deal falls apart or closes, right?
Yeah, I mean, the buyer's not in a hurry. It's great.
Right.
Right. Okay.
I think there was another question. Susie, maybe?
Yes. So I missed the whole part about the thank you letters. Is that something that you have the buyer prepare ahead of time and then leave on the counter with your card?
Yep. And and if you really want to get fancy, like maybe put a $5 or $10 Starbucks gift card in there, right?
Fabulous.
Like, hey, thanks for letting us see your house. I'm sure it's been a zoo for the past 3 days. We really appreciate you taking the time to make your house look nice, burning up your electric bill, whatever you want to put in there, right? But it just sets you apart, and be careful about what you put in there as far as protected class stuff. And whatever.
Okay.
Keep it short, sweet, and about the property. Okay?
Perfect. Thanks.
2 more, guys, and then if you guys have other ideas for the group, that's okay too. So One obviously is that speed is important. So if you are the first people in there, right, and you can get an offer going super quick, doesn't mean that the seller has to respond. However, one of the things that you could potentially do, right, is say, hey, if this offer is accepted on or before today at 8 p.m., the offer price is going to be $410,000. If it doesn't get accepted by 8 p.m., if it gets accepted by tomorrow at 5, the offer price is going to be $405. Okay, that might put the seller in a position of saying, hey, I don't want to lose out on this, extra $5,000, right? And I would rather just take it knowing what we have on the table and not risk not knowing what we don't have. Okay. So you could make, again, a tiered acceptance deadline, or a tiered price that's based on an acceptance deadline to try to get them to sign your offer quick so that you don't have to compete. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is if you say, hey, our offer is $410 if you accept it by tonight at 8, or $405 if you accept it tomorrow at 5. Well, if it goes beyond 8 o'clock, now you've got a worse offer, and potentially they could, instead of just accepting your offer, say, hey, you just told me you were willing to pay $410. I'm just going to counter you at $410, even though it's tomorrow by this point, right? So again, that fear of missing out, right? Sometimes if you're working with a broker who doesn't quite understand, like, oh, I can just counter them instead of accepting the way that they wrote it. Okay, you might be able to squeeze one past them and get that seller, based on that fear of missing that $5,000, to speed up their response and say, I don't want to lose it. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Okay, and then as a last effort, and I really don't like you guys doing this, but potentially reduce your commission, right? In some cases, right, if I have a $300,000 buyer, I can either continue to show them 100 homes and compete in every single one of those, and take my time to drive them around and writing 100 offers. Right? My time is fairly valuable. I don't know what kind of dollar value you place on your time, but if it's a matter of kicking in a couple grand to get it done so that I can get in on it and move on, and then spend my time on something that is more efficient, right? You can always do what works best for you. Now, our office policy is that you can't take less than 2%, unless of course offering less than 2%, right? Without some kind of leadership approval. Okay, but that talk to leadership if for whatever reason you feel like you need some kind of exception to that. I don't want that to be the rule. I want that to be an exception to the rule. But in some cases, right, I've done it. I was spent working with these people. Knew if I didn't do it, it was never going to get accepted. I was going to continue to spin my wheels. Right. And it just made sense for me to make $4,000 instead of $6,000 and take that $2,000 worth of time and spend it on something more valuable.
I just needed the paddles for Rich. Rich, do you need the paddles? You okay?
I'm shaking right now.
Yep. And there are plenty of differing opinions on that, but just
I'm with you, Jesse. You talked me into it that one time.
It's all about opportunity cost, right? Yep. And for me, again, I got to know that I would rather, if it's going to cost me $2,000 in commission, right? But it's going to take me another, 60 hours worth of showing properties and writing contracts before I actually get them locked down on something. Like, figure out your dollars per hour, and I'm worth more than that. Okay. If your time is not that valuable, then by all means stick to your 3%. Or 2.8 or whatever it is that they're offering you, and go spend your 60 hours, showing them properties and writing contracts and, writing your little notes to the sellers and spending money on Starbucks gift cards to leave on their counter. I'm not going to make that decision for you. And I know both sides of the argument well. Okay. So if you absolutely refuse, I appreciate that. And I support you in that 100%. And at the same time, if you understand opportunity cost, then you might have a different position, is all I'm saying. Okay.
Jesse, how would
Yeah.
you write that into the contract?
Yeah, good question. So, and I've had questions on this before because they're like, well, technically the listing broker would earn that extra commission, right? Like, let's say I'm going to, take $2,000 less, right? They're like, well, doesn't that theoretically mean that the listing broker would just pocket the extra $2,000? Well, first of all, the intent, right, was not that the listing broker would pocket it. And so I don't think that would ever hold up in court, right? But if you wanted to put a provision in there, I typically what I'll do is I'll just come down to the broker section right here, right? And it defines, some terms in here. And so, I'll use the term straight from here, and I'll just say, buyer and seller agree that at the buyer's discretion, the buyer's brokerage firm's compensation will be reduced from, $6,000 to $4,000, and $2,000 will be, returned to the seller or kept by the seller, however you want to word it, right? Just make sure that it's clear, and you can use defined terms in the contract. The brokerage firm is a defined term, it's capitalized here. And then brokerage firm's compensation or commission, even though these aren't really defined, right? You're just using the verbiage from the contract. So you would just put that into additional provisions.
When I have succumbed to a commission reduction in the past, I traditionally, because I get 7% on my residential listings, in order to get that 7%, I offer that up at the signing of the listing. I say, listen, if we come to a negotiations and we're a few $100 short, that 7% commission I can throw in to cover the shortage.
Yeah.
And then we usually can negotiate that out. If it comes to I got to pay for something, I'll bring a check to closing and I'll indicate that in the contract.
If you're going to do that, definitely it needs to be in writing. It needs to be all above board. So don't be changing hands at the closing table, money changing hands at the closing table unless it's all above board. So
sure. But that, Harry is right. I get nauseous when I even think of it, but
like last resort, but I'll be the first to tell you that I've done it.
Yep. Me too.
But Jesse, couldn't all this be done on an amend and not mess it up in the contract itself?
Well, it could be, but if your goal in a multiple offer situation is to get your foot in the door, right, then as the buyer's agent, if you're waiting until you do an amendment, you may be not even giving yourself an opportunity to get that foot in the door, right? So, I would typically just put it in the contract to buy and sell if it's a multiple offer situation. Certainly there are cases, where, we're just too far apart on appraisal. And so they're trying to squeeze listing broker, buyer's broker, buyer, seller, right? Everybody's having to come together a little bit to make it work. But yeah, you can certainly do an amend in those cases. But again, if we're writing an offer in a competing situation, and that's one of the tactics that you are going to use, then just do it in the offer so that way the seller knows right up front, hey, that's $2,000 more in my pocket for this offer than it is for some other, otherwise similar offer.
Okay.
Now, I have a question, Jesse.
Yep.
Now, is it that commission reduction that is synonymous with a rebate, correct? Or is that to your own your own client?
You're not rebating it to your client, right? You're just telling the seller, hey, you as far as your total amount that you'd have to pay for commissions, I'm decreasing that by $2,000, putting that in your pocket. So there is no actual rebate of the commission there because you didn't earn it as commission dollars, okay? And then the other piece that I'll tell you is a commission rebate is perfectly legal as long as it is done properly. And I'm not going to get into the weeds in this class, but you can go read the Colorado Real Estate Manual, and a rebate in and of itself is not a violation. Now, there are RESPA things to consider, and then there are disclosures regarding the buyer's, financial position. If they had to, receive that rebate from you in order to qualify, well, then that's an adverse material fact about the buyer situation that you have to disclose, right? So there's some disclosure stuff, there's some RESPA stuff, but a rebate of the commission in and of itself is not against any license law, okay?
I think if the offer is not accepted, you're just telling your buyer that you're willing to lower your commission. I don't know if that's a good deal or not.
Yeah, again, guys, I'm not advocating for it. I'm not a fan of doing that. It's just at some point you might get to a point where, hey, I've already shown you 50 properties and we wrote 10 offers, right? Like if I got to drop $2,500 to make it happen, and that's what gets the deal done, then yeah, it might be something that I'm willing to do so that I don't have to show you 50 more and write 10 more offers. So use it as, again, like I'm not advising you that you should do all of these things. It's just know that you have lots of options and lots of tactics at your disposal to use to make your particular situation work.
Just to be clear for a second, Jesse. So let's say the seller and the buyer, let's say the house is 400 and the buyer is only willing to pay $399. Can you then give up that $1,000 and should you put that in the contract? Is that what you were saying?
You can, but in a competing situation, like I don't know, there's no point making a move on that house if it's going to be a multiple offer situation where everything is going to go. And guys, obviously every market is a little bit different, but just to give you real numbers, I mean, we've had brokers in the past week who have had clients get beat, with $20,000 over, $25,000, $30,000 over. Like, it just depends on the price point. It depends on how well priced the home is to begin with. It depends on a lot of things, but going in at full price in this market, unless it's a home that's been on the market for a while, you're probably just spinning your wheel. I'm just telling you honestly, so that you know what to expect for, what to prepare your clients for. If you have a client who's only approved up to 400, there's probably very little purpose in showing them a house that's listed at 400,000 right now, honestly. Other questions? You guys have any like crazy ideas that have worked for your clients in multiple offer situations?
Hey, Jesse.
Yep.
One of the things that I've done is had my lender, I don't think you went over this, but have my lender call the listing agent.
Yep.
And talk about the buyer.
Yep. Yeah. And make sure that, they're actually talking, assuming that your buyer probably has been pre-approved as opposed to just pre-qualified, right? Like having your lender say, hey, I actually have the buyer's tax returns. I've already verified their employment. I've pulled their credit, right? So that way I know at least I have a little bit more confidence in, the fact that you've actually got all of this stuff instead of, hey, the buyer told me how much they made and I told them how much they could afford, right? Like that really, a pre-qual letter is trash in my opinion. And a pre-approval letter is like, just barely outside the trash. Nothing is 100% until it's done and closed. There's always things that can come up. Yeah, certainly having a lender who's willing to reach out could certainly help your chances. I will also tell you that there's some times where I'm just so fed up with phone calls on a listing that's crazy hot that I don't want to talk to the lender. So I don't know, sometimes an email might be good. Figure out, that's one of the things that I kind of skipped over, but part of that professional communication with the listing broker might be, hey, how do you prefer to communicate, right? And for me, I would prefer email because that kind of becomes my checklist of things that I need to do in my inbox, right? And so if they send me an email saying, hey, here's the stuff, I've got their credit and all this other crap, then honestly, personally, that's what I would prefer as opposed to a phone call from the lender, because I don't want to, listen to them beat their chest and tell you how amazing their buyer is and how many deals they've done in the last year and try to get me to do business with them. Like, send me an email telling me that your client's pre-approved and that you've pulled their credit and that you've checked their taxes and you've verified their employment. Like, and that's what I want to know. But yeah, good point. Anybody else? Any
I got
other-
a little bit of a problem with obtaining the tax returns.
Okay.
That's something, there's a lot of, especially social security numbers and things like that. It's just a discomfort level that a buyer would have. Let's say I'm a stranger of a month. I've been working with them a month. You know, I would prefer not to take it and just have them get pre-approved with some lender and then give me a pre-approval. That's just me.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things. One is those tax returns are not going to go to the listing broker. That's not what I'm saying, right? And you know, if the listing broker is, if you're going to go so far as to say, hey, listing broker, who is your preferred lender, right? Because my client is going to use them, then probably if it's their preferred lender, it's somebody that they trust as a lender. Do you trust them or do you not? I don't know, but that being said, at some point, tax returns are going to become part of the deal, regardless of which lender they're going to go with. And so if they're going to take those steps up front to get pre-approved, like one of the lenders is going to have them anyway, right?
And that's
So-
fine between the buyer and the lender. I just don't want in that little chain of transfer.
Yeah. There's no reason for you as the listing broker to, don't take their tax return.
Right. But your point on using the listing agent's preferred lender, that's brilliant. Never done that. Never thought of that.
Yeah.
That's
And
a great little.
I can tell you that if I got two relatively similar offers and one of them said, hey, Jesse, who's your preferred lender? Because that's who we're working with. No question in my mind, even if there was a difference of a couple $1,000, whatever, right? If my lender says that they can get it done, my lender is going to get it done. And I have that kind of relationship with my lender. If you don't, go network with lenders until you find that person. And sometimes it's hard to know, right, until you've done enough deals with them. But if somebody comes to me and says, who's your preferred lender? Because I'm going to use them, I'm going to push for that deal to get done, not because there's kickbacks or anything like that, but because I know the deal can get closed. So,
yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Because that's all I got, a short little list for you guys.
Another brilliant little tidbit that I picked up today is that tiered acceptance time, where they'll get more money if they accept it quicker.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And again, it can work against you. So just make sure you're advising your buyer as to the pros and cons of doing that. Same thing with those tiered escalation clauses, right? Versus a financed offer or a cash offer. Those can work against you too, right? Like, hey, you told me you do $5,000 over a cash offer. I'm just going to take $5,000 over any offer. I don't give a crap whether it's cash or not. I'm not accepting it. I'm going to counter you, and we're going to wipe that clause out and just counter you at $5,000 over what we've got. Okay. So again, important to know, I mean, almost every one of these carries with it to some degree or another some risk, right? And don't try to couple all 38 or 40 of them or however many. That's a lot of risk, and that's a lot that you're putting on a buyer. But certainly it's something that you can compile as a list, right? And then you can present that to your buyers and say, hey, we're in a competing situation. I want you to, let's talk about these things and let's figure out what your comfort level is on some of these, right? And go through that list with them and see what they're willing to do. And there are some that will stand out more than others, and see what works for you guys. So, okay.
Quick question on that. I see in the instructions where it says, seller will look at all offers Sunday night at 9 p.m.
Yep.
You still do one of those escalation clauses, or would you respect that statement?
You're talking about where I try to speed it up?
Correct.
You got to counsel with your buyers, guys. I can't tell you a one size fits all answer. Talk to your buyers and see what your buyers want to do. If the sellers feel like you're trying to rush them, then they may not like that and they may respond negatively to it. If you know that there's other offers on the table already, then I typically won't do that, because I already don't know if I'm the best offer, right? I could try to speed you up all I want. And if they look at it and they're like, well, yeah, your offer is not as good as the ones we have on the table anyway. No, I'm not going to do it. Like it doesn't do any good. Right. So, again, counsel with your buyers, talk to them about the pros and the cons of it.
Awesome.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Jesse. Go
ahead.
Oh, yeah. Just a quick question. I just want to rewind to the limited inspection on the major components. That was interesting. I've not heard of that before. Now, do you recommend that for the objection deadline, waiving the objection deadline, and also the termination deadline? Or do you never waive the termination deadline?
Well, again, it just kind of depends. If I have an inspector who's willing to go with me to the showing, right, and inspect those major components, and then again, you're probably not going to get a written inspection report because that's part of what takes up inspectors' time. And if they're going to offer you, a discount and whatever else, right, they may just go with you and say, hey, I'm just going to look at this stuff real quick. The big stuff has no, it's not going to include the little things, right? Then if your buyer is comfortable, then you can waive the termination as well. Short of doing that, it's extremely risky to just flat out waive an inspection termination in addition to your objection resolution. And I would probably advise my buyers not to do that in most cases, because what if it has aluminum wiring, or what if it has foundation issues that you couldn't see? Or what if the roof is crap that, you didn't bring your ladder to your showing, right? Like there's a lot of risk in doing that, but it really just depends on the buyer. Like I can't answer whether I would do these things in a one size fits all situation for the most, for most of these things. It really just depends on the buyer's comfort level.
Okay.
Okay.
Jesse, one thing that I do on my when I'm representing the buyers is I usually call the listing broker and say, is there anything beyond price that would be important to your sellers? I just feel like that helps you put together a deal they're going to be more happy with.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, I mean, the question that I typically will ask is what can set my offer apart as the best offer that the sellers are going to accept, right? And some agents are a little more loose-lipped about it than others. Some of them aren't going to give you any really good information, which I think is a disservice to their clients. But other brokers will and use it to your advantage for sure. Okay, that's all I got.
Jess?
For you guys. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Just quick announcement.
Sure.
You may be seeing, the group here may be seeing a little class I'm having on it's called Getting Paid What You're Worth. And that should come out, hopefully not in a Zoom, but I'll do a Zoom. It's not as exciting as it is live, but and I won't mention 7 and 10% because that's price fixing, but we're going to go into how to get more commissions rather than reducing your commission to get the deal. There's ways to increase your commission. So you'll see a Zoom announcement. Anybody's welcome to sit in on it, and it's life-changing. I've gotten 7% since 1978. And
there you go.
Hey, living proof. But anyway, that's it. Thanks,
Okay.
Jeff.
All right. Anybody else have anything? Okay. Thanks for coming, guys. We'll see you. Oh, someone have something?
As usual, Jeff.
Thank you.
As usual, great job.
Yep,
Yeah,
you
great
bet. We'll
job.
see you guys. Holla if you have any questions.
Later, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.